Welcome to Forbidden Tales. I came home that evening to the faint aroma of something cooking. It wasn't typical for Melissa to be in the kitchen. This late her idea of a meal usually came in takeout boxes, yet here she was, standing by the counter dressed in that blue sundress I loved. It clung just enough to remind me of the woman I'd fallen for years ago, back when things felt simpler, lighter. She looked up as I walked in, her lips curving into a smile that didn't quite meet her eyes. "David," she said softly, wiping her hands on a towel, "I've got a surprise for you." A surprise? Those words didn't usually come with anything good attached, not lately, but tonight there was something different in her tone. She seemed eager, maybe even nervous. My gaze swept over the kitchen, the dimmed lights, the candles flickering on the table. It all felt out of place, but before I could say anything, Melissa walked over and slipped her hand into mine. Her palm was cool, slightly damp, like she'd been sweating. "What's all this?" I asked, nodding toward the setup. "Just sit down," she said, ignoring the question. She guided me to the table where a small gift box with a white ribbon sat waiting. "Go on, open it." I hesitated for a moment, studying her face. There was something about the way her smile hovered, forced, almost like it was glued in place. Still, I picked up the box and untied the ribbon, the lid lifting with a faint creak. Inside were the tiniest baby shoes I'd ever seen, white, soft, with delicate ribbons that looked like they'd come straight out of a Hallmark commercial. It took a moment for my brain to catch up. My heart skipped and I glanced at Melissa. "You're pregnant." She nodded, her smile widening though her hands trembled as she placed them over her stomach. "We're going to have a baby, David." For a second I couldn't speak. Years of trying, of doctor visits, of late night conversations about what we'd do if it never happened. It all hit me at once. The air seemed too thin, my chest tight with something between joy and disbelief. I stood, wrapping my arms around her before I even realized what I was doing. "Are you serious, Melissa? This is amazing. I can't believe it. We're finally going to be parents." She laughed, the sound shaky but warm, and leaned into me. "I wanted it to be perfect when I told you. That's why I waited." The rest of the evening passed in a blur. We ate dinner, though I couldn't tell you what it was, and talked about everything. Well, mostly I talked names, nursery themes, whether it be a boy or a girl. Melissa mostly listened, nodding along and smiling. When I got carried away, every so often she'd reach for her wine glass, pausing just before taking a sip, like she'd forgotten she wasn't supposed to drink anymore. I teased her about it and she laughed it off, saying old habits die hard. In the following days my excitement only grew. I found myself daydreaming at work, imagining what our life would look like with a baby in it. The late night feedings, the first steps, the laughter that would fill the house. I started researching cribs and baby monitors, making mental lists of what we'd need. Melissa seemed happy too, though her enthusiasm felt quieter. She smiled when I brought home parenting books and nodded along when I suggested we start looking into daycare options, but whenever I asked about her next doctor's appointment she waved me off. "It's just a routine checkup," she said when I offered to come along. "No need to make a fuss." "But I want to be there." I pressed. "This is our baby, Melissa." She sighed, her fingers toying with the edge of the table. "I know, it's just I feel like everything's moving so fast. I need some time to process it all, and those appointments can be stressful. I don't want you worrying over every little thing." It didn't sit right with me, but I didn't push. Melissa had always been independent and I chalked it up to her way of handling things. Still, the unease lingered, gnawing at the edges of my thoughts. There were other moments too, small things that should have been easy to dismiss but weren't, like the way she kept her phone screen angled away when she texted, or the time she came home late claiming she lost track of time at the grocery store. Her explanations made sense on the surface, but there was a tension in her voice I couldn't ignore. One night I caught her staring out the window, her reflection ghostly in the glass. "You okay?" I asked, coming up behind her. She startled, spinning around with a forced smile. "Of course," she said quickly, "just thinking about everything we've been through to get here. It's a lot." I wanted to believe her. God, I wanted to, but even then something in me whispered that not everything was as it seemed at that moment. Though I shoved the doubts aside, this was supposed to be our fresh start, the happy ending we'd fought for. And for now I was willing to cling to that hope, even if the edges were starting to fray. The weeks after Melissa's announcement felt like a dream I didn't want to wake up from, but small cracks in the perfect picture began to form. It started with little things I could have easily overlooked if I hadn't been paying attention. Melissa began spending more time out of the house, citing errands that seemed to take longer than they should. When she came home she was always in a hurry to shower or change, her explanations just barely making sense. "It was a long line at the store," she said one evening, tossing her keys onto the counter with a little too much force. "You wouldn't believe how slow the cashier was. That Might have been believable except the grocery bags she carried in had barely anything in them, a loaf of bread, a carton of milk, not the haul you'd expect from 2 hours out. I let it slide though. Melissa had always been a bit scatterbrained and I told myself I was being paranoid, but the unease only grew. Her phone became a constant companion, always within reach and always turned face down on the table if it buzzed with a notification and I glanced over. She'd casually sweep it into her lap or the pocket of her robe. When I asked who she was texting, she shrugged and said it was work. Mark been on my case about those reports, she said, rolling her eyes. It's like he forgets I'm not his assistant. Mark, I'd met him a couple of times at company events, a sharp-dressed guy with an easy smile and a knack for drawing attention. He was one of those people you couldn't quite pin down, friendly but with an edge that set your teeth on edge if you looked too closely. Melissa had never mentioned him much before, but now his name seemed to pop up every other day. It wasn't just her phone. Melissa had started staying late at work more often, claiming deadlines or last-minute meetings. I wanted to believe her, but I couldn't ignore the tightness in her smile when she told me, or the way she avoided my eyes. Don't wait up, she'd say, as she grabbed her bag and kissed me on the cheek. It wasn't like Melissa to brush me off so easily, but I kept telling myself she was just overwhelmed. After all, she was pregnant. There was a lot on her plate. Maybe I was being selfish, letting my own insecurities creep in when she needed my support. Even our friends and family didn't seem to notice anything amiss when we announced the pregnancy. They were ecstatic. My mom cried, hugging Melissa like she was a miracle worker. My best friend Mike slapped me on the back and joked about teaching the kid how to fish. Everyone acted like we were the perfect couple, finally getting the blessing we deserved. But behind the smiles and congratulations, I felt like an outsider. In my own life, Melissa didn't include me in any of the doctor visits, and when I asked about them her answers were vague. It's just routine stuff, she'd say, brushing it off like it wasn't a big deal. Everything's fine, I promise. I wanted to push to insist on going with her, but I stopped myself. Melissa had always been fiercely independent and I didn't want to smother her. Besides, I told myself she'd never give me a reason to doubt her. Not Melissa, not my wife. The turning point came one night when I woke up to the sound of her voice. At first I thought she was talking to herself, but as I listened it became clear she was on the phone. Her voice was low, urgent, as if she didn't want to wake me. I told you I can't keep doing this, she whispered, the words barely audible over the thewing of my heart. He's starting to notice. I froze, every nerve in my body screaming at me to get up and confront her, but I didn't. Instead I lay there straining to catch more of the conversation. It was no use, she was too quiet. After a few minutes, the talking stopped and I heard the creak of the floorboards as she moved toward the kitchen. When I finally worked up the courage to follow her, I found her standing by the sink, staring out the window with her phone clutched tightly in her hand. She jumped when I spoke. Couldn't sleep, I asked, keeping my voice casual. She turned, her smile quick and brittle. Just some work stuff on my mind at this hour, she shrugged, slipping her phone into her pocket. Deadlines don't care about the time. I didn't push her, though my chest felt like it might explode from the tension. Instead I kissed her forehead and went back to bed, pretending everything was fine, but I couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something was very, very wrong. The next day I tried to rationalize it. Maybe I'd misheard her, maybe the stress of the pregnancy really was getting to her, but deep down I knew the seeds of doubt had been planted, and no matter how much I wanted to, I couldn't unsee the cracks in the facade. By the time Melissa left for work the next morning, I couldn't shake the memory of her hushed conversation from the night before. Her words looped in my head like a bad song. I can't keep doing this, he's starting to notice. It wasn't the kind of thing you said about a deadline or a difficult client. It was personal, too personal. I spent the day trying to focus on work, but the unease gnawed at me, making it impossible to concentrate. Every time my phone buzzed I half expected it to be a message from Melissa, some kind of explanation or reassurance, but all I got were calendar reminders and emails I didn't care about. When she came home that evening she acted like everything was normal, humming to herself as she dropped her bag on the counter. I wanted to believe her, I really did, but the more I watched her move around the house the more I noticed the little things: how she avoided looking me in the eye, how she timed when her phone buzzed in her pocket, how she kept checking the time like she had somewhere else she'd rather be. That night after Melissa went to bed, I sat in the living room staring at her phone on the coffee table. She always kept it locked, but I'd seen her enter the passcode 100 times. It was second nature to her now, so quick and casual she probably never realized I was paying attention. The moment I was sure she was asleep I reached for the phone, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might wake her. I entered the Code her birthday and held my breath as the screen unlocked. At first there was nothing unusual, just the usual apps, a few unread notifications from Instagram and Pinterest, but then I opened her messages and my stomach dropped. There it was, a thread with a name I recognized, all too well marked. The conversation stretched back weeks, a mix of emojis and inside jokes that made my skin crawl. The texts were flirty, sure, but it was the recent messages that made my hands shake. Mark, did you tell him yet? Melissa, not yet, I need more time. Mark, we can't keep this up forever. Babe, Melissa, I know, just trust me, okay? And then just a few days ago, Mark, do you think he suspects anything? Melissa, not yet, but he's been asking more questions. I had to stop reading, my vision blurred as the words swam in front of me. I couldn't process what I was seeing, couldn't make sense of it. All I knew was that my wife, the woman I loved and trusted for years, was hiding something. I forced myself to keep scrolling, needing to know just how deep this went. The messages got worse, more intimate. They talked about meeting up about, and worst of all, there were references to the baby. Mark, you think it'll look like me? Melissa, don't say that, it's too soon to even think about. The world seemed to tilt under me, my hands clenched so hard around the phone that I thought it might crack. The baby, our baby, wasn't mine, it couldn't be. I put the phone back exactly where I'd found it and stumbled to the kitchen, needing something to steady myself. The whiskey bottle was half empty, but I didn't bother with a glass. I drank straight from the neck, the burn doing nothing to numb the ache spreading through my chest. Every memory I had of Melissa suddenly felt tainted, twisted into something ugly. The way she'd smiled when she told me she was pregnant, the nights we'd spent talking about our future, it had all been a lie, or at least it felt like one. I spent the rest of the night in the living room staring at the walls and trying to make sense of what I'd found. By the time the sun came up, I knew what I had to do. I couldn't confront her, not yet. I needed more than just a few text messages, I needed proof. Melissa came downstairs around 8, looking surprised to see me awake. Did you sleep out here? She asked, brushing her hair out of her face. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. She studied me for a moment, her expression unreadable, before heading to the kitchen to make coffee. As she moved around humming to herself like nothing was wrong, I felt the first flicker of something I hadn't felt before. Anger, not just anger at her, but at myself for being so blind, for letting her fool me. But that anger wasn't a weakness, it was fuel, and I was going to use it to find out the truth, no matter how much it hurt. The anger simmered beneath the surface as the days passed, a quiet, steady flame that kept me moving forward. Confronting Melissa without hard proof felt like a gamble I couldn't afford. If she denied everything, and she would, there'd be nothing stopping her from twisting the narrative, turning me into the paranoid husband who didn't trust his pregnant wife. No, I needed something undeniable, something she couldn't explain away. The opportunity came on a Sunday morning. Melissa had gone out for her usual errands, leaving me alone in the house. I waited until I heard her car pull out of the driveway before I made my move. Her bathroom trash can was the first place I checked, and there it was, a tissue with a faint smear of lipstick still damp. My stomach churned as I picked it up with a gloved hand and sealed it in a plastic bag. It felt ridiculous, like something out of a bad TV drama, but I didn't care. I had a friend from college, Mike, who worked in a lab. We'd stayed close over the years, and I knew he wouldn't ask too many questions. That afternoon I called him. Mike, I need a favor. He laughed. What, you get into trouble with the law or something? Not quite, I said, forcing a chuckle. It's personal. I need a paternity test done. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. You serious? Dead serious. Mike didn't press me for details, he just told me where to drop off the sample and promised he'd keep it off the books. I thanked him, my voice tight, and hung up. The waiting was the hardest part. Every time Melissa smiled at me or reached for my hand, I had to fight the urge to pull away. The trust between us, once so solid, so natural, felt like it had been hollowed out, replaced by suspicion and doubt. At night, idly awake next to her, listening to the soft rhythm of her breathing and wondering how long she'd been lying to me. Had it started before the pregnancy, or had it begun when she realized the baby wasn't mine? The questions were endless, and none of them had answers. 2 weeks later, Mick called. David, he said, his tone unusually serious. I've got your results. My throat felt like it had closed up, and he hesitated. It's not a match. The baby isn't yours. I didn't say anything. I couldn't. The confirmation hit me like a punch to the gut, knocking the wind out of me. I'd been holding on to a sliver of hope, some desperate belief that I'd been wrong, but there it was, clear and undeniable. David, Mike's voice broke through the silence. You okay? Yeah, I managed, though the word came out like a croak. Thanks, Mike. I owe you. You don't owe me anything, he said quietly. Take care of yourself, man. I hung up and sat there for what felt like hours, staring at the wall and trying to process what I just heard. The baby wasn't mine. Melissa's lies had reached a level I hadn't even dared to imagine. The anger came back hotter and sharper than before. It burned away the last remnants of doubt, leaving only clarity in its wake. Melissa had betrayed me in the worst possible way, and I wasn't going to let her get away with it. That evening I cooked dinner, a rare occurrence in our house. Melissa looked surprised when she came home, her eyebrows arching as she walked into the kitchen. "What's all this?" she asked, dropping her bag on the counter. "Just thought we could have a nice dinner together," I said, keeping my tunnel. She smiled, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. "That's sweet." We sat down at the table, and for a while it almost felt normal. We talked about work, about the house, about the baby. Melissa laughed at something I said, her hand resting lightly on her stomach, but beneath the surface I was boiling. Every word out of her mouth felt like a knife twisting in my chest. After dinner she went upstairs to take a shower, and I followed her with my eyes, my jaw clenched so tight it hurt. The shower ran for a long time, the sound muffled by the walls, and I sat in the living room staring at the empty wine glass she left behind when she finally came back downstairs, her hair damp and her cheeks flushed. "I stood." "Melissa," I said, my voice steady, "we need to talk." Her smile faltered. "What about?" "Not tonight," I said, my tone soft but firm. Soon. She hesitated, her eyes searching mine for answers, but I didn't give her any. She nodded slowly and went to bed, leaving me alone in the dark in living room. I sat there for hours, going over everything in my head, the lies, the betrayal, the evidence I now had. Melissa thought she was in control, thought she could keep the truth hidden, but she was wrong, very wrong. The weight of the paternity results hung over me like a storm cloud, dark and suffocating. Every moment I spent in the same house as Melissa felt like a charade, a cruel joke I had to endure until the time was right. But I wasn't just going to confront her, I was going to expose her, rip apart the web of lies she'd so carefully spun on. The idea came to me during one of her endless late-night absences. She claimed she was working late again, and I didn't bother asking questions. Instead, I sat in the kitchen staring at the stack of mail on the counter when an invitation caught my eye. It was addressed to her, a glossy card inviting her to a baby shower hosted by a coworker. That's when it hit me, a baby shower Melissa would never see it coming. Over the next week I put the plan in motion. I called her closest friends, her family, even some of my own relatives. I told them I wanted to throw Melissa a surprise baby shower, a way to celebrate the incredible news of our growing family. Everyone jumped on board, their excitement fueling my resolve. "Oh, David, that's so thoughtful of you," my mother-in-law gushed over the phone. "Melissa will be thrilled." If only she knew. I booked a small banquet hall at a local restaurant and spent hours working out the details, decorations, catering, music. I made sure everything looked perfect, but my focus wasn't on the party itself, it was on what would happen once the guests arrived. In the days leading up to the event I kept Melissa in the dark. She noticed my late nights at the computer and my frequent phone calls, but when she asked I shrugged it off. "Work stuff," I said, borrowing her favorite excuse she didn't press, which only made my suspicion grow. If she had any idea what I was planning, she didn't let on. The morning of the shower I watched her leave the house in a rush, claiming she needed to pick up a few things for work. I waited until she was gone before double-checking everything. The paternity test results were printed and sealed in an envelope. The messages between her and Mark were neatly compiled in a slideshow I'd prepared on my laptop. The evidence was damning, and I was ready to deliver it when Melissa returned that afternoon. I greeted her with a smile. "Get dressed," I said. "We going out?" Her eyes narrowed. "Where?" "It's a surprise," I replied, keeping my tone light. "You see," she hesitated, clearly suspicious, but eventually relented. By the time we arrived at the venue her confusion had turned to curiosity. The parking lot was packed, and as we walked inside, the sound of laughter and conversation greeted us. "David, what is this?" she asked, her voice tinged with disbelief. "So surprised," I said, leading her into the room. The look on her face was almost worth it. The decorations, the banner that read "Congratulations Melissa" in bold letters, the crowd of smiling faces, it was everything she could have wanted. For a moment she seemed genuinely happy, her smile wide and genuine as she hugged her friends and family. But as the party went on I kept my distance, watching her from across the room. She laughed, Ed, for pictures, and accepted compliments with a practiced grace that made my blood boil. She had no idea what was coming. When the time came for my speech I stepped up to the front of the room, tapping a fork against a glass to get everyone's attention. "Thank you all for coming," I began, my voice steady. "I wanted to do something special for Melissa, to show her how much she means to me and how excited I am about our future together." Melissa beamed at me from her seat, her hands resting effectively over her stomach. The sight of her made my stomach churn, but I pushed through. This pregnancy has been a dream come true for us, I continued, but it's also been a journey, one that's taught me a lot about trust, love and honesty. The room grew quiet, the mood shifting as my tone darkened. I turned to Melissa, locking eyes with her, and sometimes the truth isn't what it seems. Her smile faltered, confusion flickering across her face. David, what are you talking about? I reached for the envelope, holding it up for everyone to see. This, I said, my voice rising, is a paternity test. I had it done a few weeks ago and it confirmed what I already suspected. The room erupted in whispers, faces turning toward Melissa. She froze, her expression a mix of shock and fear. The baby, I said, my voice trembling with barely contained rage, isn't mine. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Melissa shot to her feet, her hands shaking. David, stop, this isn't the place. No, I interrupted, cutting her off. This is exactly the place. You've been lying to me, to everyone. You think I didn't know about Mark, about the affair? I've seen the messages, Melissa, I know everything. Tears well in her eyes, but I felt no sympathy. The room buzzed with shock and disbelief as I pulled out my laptop and connected it to the projector. The screen lit up with screenshots of her conversations with Mark, the incriminating texts laid bare for everyone to see. Melissa crumbled under the weight of the evidence, her protests growing weaker as the room turned against her. Friends and family stared at her in disgust, their voices rising in a cacophony of anger and betrayal. By the time the slideshow ended, Melissa was sobbing, her carefully constructed facade shattered. I stood there watching her fall apart, and for the first time in weeks I felt a sense of peace. The lies were over, the truth was out, and this was only the beginning of her reckoning. The room was chaos, voices overlapped, sharp and angry, as Melissa stood frozen in the middle of it all. Her cheeks were wet with tears, her chest heaving as she looked around for some form of salvation. None came. Everyone was too stunned or too disgusted to meet her eyes. David, please, she choked out, her voice breaking. This isn't what you think. I stood at the front of the room, arms crossed, staring her down. Isn't it? I shot back. My voice was cold, almost unrecognizable even to me, because the messages, the paternity test, the lies, Melissa, it all paints a pretty clear picture. Her hands clenched into fists at her sides as she tried to regain control. It's not that simple, she stammered. Mark, he doesn't mean anything. It was a mistake. A mistake, I said, my tone sharp. Was it a mistake when you told him about the pregnancy? Was it a mistake when you lied to my face over and over and let me believe that child was mine? The crowd murmured in agreement, the anger in the room growing palpable. Melissa turned to her mother, reaching out as if for support, but the older woman recoiled, shaking her head in disbelief. How could you, Melissa? Her mother hissed. After everything David's done for you, Mom, please, Melissa begged, her voice cracking. You don't understand. I understand enough, her mother interrupted, her voice trembling with anger. I thought you were better than this. Mark's name had come up in the whispers, and it didn't take long for someone to ask the question that hung in the air like poison. Where is Mark? One of her friends asked loudly. Melissa flinched, her eyes darting around the room as though hoping he might materialize to defend her, but of course, he wasn't there. Mark had always been a coward, and it seemed his bravery had run out the moment things got messy. I wasn't finished. Not yet, Melissa, I said, my voice cutting through the noise. Do you want to tell everyone how long this has been going on, or should I? She shook her head violently, tears streaming down her face. David, please stop. Why should I snapped. You didn't stop when you were sneaking off to see him. You didn't stop when you were lying to my face. So tell me, why should I stop now? The weight of the room pressed down on her and she sank into a chair, her head in her hands. For a moment I thought she might finally tell the truth, but instead she just sat there shaking with sobs. I turned to the crowd, my chest heaving. I'm sorry you all had to see this, I said, my voice heavy with bitterness, but the truth needed to come out. Melissa has been lying to me, to all of us, and I'm done pretending everything's fine. The silence that followed was deafening. Friends and family exchanged stunned looks, their expressions a mix of pity and outrage. No one spoke up for her, no one came to her defense. Finally I walked over to the table where the unopened gifts sat, a cruel reminder of the celebration this was supposed to be. Without a word I picked up a box, handed it to her, and leaned in close enough for only her to hear. Enjoy the presents, I said, my voice low and sharp. You'll need them when you're raising that child on your own. Then I turned and walked out, leaving her behind in a room full of people who now saw her for who she really was. As I stepped outside into the crisp evening air, I felt something I hadn't expected, relief. The weight of her lies was gone, and for the first time in weeks I could breathe. But I wasn't done yet. There were still steps to take, loose ends to tie up, and I was ready for whatever came next. In the days following the baby shower, the fallout from Melissa's lies spread like wildfire news of her betrayal rippled through our social circles and everyone had an opinion, none of them. Favorable friends who once admired her couldn't believe the truth. Family members, especially her own, expressed outrage and shame. Melissa had become a pariah in her own life and I wasn't about to shield her from the consequences. The first thing I did was file for divorce. I wasted no time, contacting a lawyer the morning after the baby shower. I wanted everything documented, the affair, the paternity test, the messages. My lawyer, a no-nonsense woman named Rachel, assured me that with the evidence I had things would go in my favor given the circumstances. She said, scanning the pile of evidence I brought to our meeting, you're in a strong position. The court won't look kindly on infidelity, especially with a child involved. It was a small comfort, but I clung to it. Melissa of course tried to reach out, leaving me voicemail after voicemail. In the beginning her messages were desperate pleas for forgiveness. David, I'm so sorry, I never meant for this to happen. Please just talk to me, we can fix this. But as the days went on and I didn't respond, her tone shifted to anger. You're really going to throw everything away over one mistake? You're not perfect either, David, don't act like you are. I deleted every message without listening to the end. Melissa tried to come by the house once, pounding on the door and yelling for me to let her in. I didn't even look out the window. Eventually she left, but not before leaving a tearful note in the mailbox, begging me to reconsider. I threw it in the trash without reading more than the first line. Meanwhile Mark had all but disappeared. Rumor had his wife had kicked him out after she received a copy of the messages I'd sent her. From what I heard, he was couch surfing, trying to lay low until the heat died down. It gave me a grim sense of satisfaction to know that his life was falling apart too. Melissa moved in with her parents, though it was clear from the awkward phone call I had with her mother that the arrangement wasn't going well. She's not handling in this gracefully, her mother admitted, the disdain in her voice barely hidden. I just don't know what's going to happen to her, David. She made her choices, I replied flatly. Now she has to live with them. As for me, I stayed in the house for a while. At least it was quiet without Melissa, almost eerily so. The silence gave me too much time to think, to replay the events that had led to this moment. Some nights I'd sit in the nursery I'd started to set up and stare at the empty crib, wondering how things had gone so wrong. But I didn't wallow for long. I threw myself into work, spending long hours at the office to distract myself. I reconnected with old friends, people I'd lost touch with during my marriage, and found solace in their company. Slowly I began to piece my life back together. The divorce was finalized a few months later. I kept the house, my savings, and most importantly my dignity. Melissa didn't fight me on much. She didn't have the leverage to. When it was over I felt a sense of finality, like I could finally close the chapter on that part of my life. I sold the house not long after. It held too many memories, most of them tainted. Now I used the money to move to a new city, a fresh start. The first night in my new apartment I sat on the balcony with a beer in hand, staring out at the skyline. For the first time in what felt like forever I felt free. Melissa faded from my life, though I'd hear things from time to time. She struggled to raise the baby on her own, bouncing between jobs and relying heavily on her parents for support. Mark was out of the picture entirely, though whether he left by choice or necessity I didn't care to find out. There was no satisfaction in her downfall, only a cold detachment. She wasn't my problem anymore. Looking back I realized that Melissa's betrayal had been a painful but necessary lesson. It had taught me to be stronger, to trust my instincts, and to value myself in ways I hadn't before. She had tried to break me, but in the end I was the one who walked away intact. As I sat there on that balcony watching the city lights flicker in the distance, I felt a quiet sense of peace. My future was mine again, and I was ready to embrace it, free from lies, free from betrayal, and free from Melissa. Subscribe so you don't miss new stories on the channel. People, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more videos like this.